Welcome, everybody. We are going to get started at 1:30. If you have questions on the right-hand side of the GoToMeeting, you can click on the chat box and add questions in here, and we'll be watching those throughout the webinar to answer any questions you have. Again, this is the maintenance of effort update and webinar, as well as there's some information about the IDEA annual application going to be presented today. We will start at 1:30. Welcome, everybody. It is 1:30. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We are going to spend this next hour giving an overview of IDEA maintenance of effort, as well as some information about the annual application for IDEA funds. This is an update for maintenance of effort again for May 2020, thinking about going forward with our new annual application. Next slide, Mary. Joining me today, I'm Candace Pelt, the Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Enhancing Student Opportunities, and I have joining with me James Fouch. James is our Fiscal Coordinator and manages all things money related to IDEA. So James is going to be presenting with us on maintenance of effort, IDEA allowable costs in the application, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. Mary, are you able to move us through the slides? So the first one that we're going to look at as soon as we get the slides back up, there we go. So the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, is our federal partners. They early on indicated they were going to look at different flexibilities and waivers. To date, there is no waiver for IDEA and for FAPE or the obligations of maintenance of effort. So as we have gone forward and planned, all of the standards for maintenance of effort remain intact as we look forward. This is going to be important for special ed directors, for business managers, for district leaders to think about as we look at the budget forecast and understanding the implications of maintenance of effort and what this means. During the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent closures, it's important to remember that the maintenance of effort standard is the assurance that's a federal requirement when you apply for IDEA funds and you accept them. The other components that are still required, we have the maintenance of financial support, which is the MFS. This is our state obligation of funds. So just like local districts have obligations for MOE, the state has an obligation to maintain the same amount of financial support in the expenditures for students who experience disability. When this is not maintained, there is a reduction in the IDEA award. We saw this last year in the 2019 award, where there was the $3.4 million reduction in IDEA due to the 2011 issuance of not meeting MFS and the failure to meet that standard. So as we plan again as a state level and we think about the efforts we have to support the expenditures for students who experience disability, it's important to remind everybody that's in a decision-making role that has the ability to lobby and share information that our expenditures in this area in particular affect future years' spending and funding. Local maintenance of effort also is required to meet the obligation even when there's reductions in general funds. And so we'll go through the standards of MOE for you to see here. The requirements an LEA has for MOE is that any district that receives funds under IDEA must meet the standards for maintenance of effort. This is even when general education budgets are reduced. The expenditure standard remains intact. This is prudent information for you to share with budget committee members, with your superintendents, with school boards and stakeholders. As we're going through exercises thinking about the budget forecast and what's ahead of us, it's really important that everybody understands this expenditure because there's a cost and an associated consequence with that if it's not maintained. So plans going forward should be thoughtful to include preparing budgets to meet the expenditure standard. And then if you have exceptions and you know you're going to have exceptions, planning for those thoughtfully. So the definition of maintenance of effort, this is an overview for people who have heard this before. This is any LEA receiving an IDEA Part B subgrant must budget and expend at least the same amount of state and local funds for the education of children who experience disability as it did in that previous year. So there's two standards that are maintained under maintenance of effort. So we call those the eligibility standard and the compliance standard. The eligibility standard is your budgeting. That's what you're doing this spring, thinking about going forward. And the expenditure standard, the compliance, is when you actually spend the funds. I want to remind, if you are new to looking at your budget, if you're new in your role, or if you have not yet sat with your business office to understand this, this is the money that we're talking about. This is not your federal money. This is the money that comes out of what's in your general chart of accounts in your 100 function code with an area of 320 designation at the end of it. And so you want to spend time with your business office if you're a new special ed director or a new district leader thinking about this to understand where that chart of accounts, where the expenditures and the budget live within those numbers. Again, this is not your IDEA grant. This is your general fund expenditure. So maintenance of effort, we get a lot of questions about why it's required when we're talking about budget reductions around the state or we're talking about not having enough money. How could we possibly hold this standard? And the federal response, as well as the states, is that it's to ensure LEAs don't replace state and local funds with federal funds, and that it means that in each year as an LEA operates, that there's the same amount budgeted and expended. And we can calculate that in a number of ways. And I also want to use this as a reminder. It's an opportunity to share that this is historically an underserved population. It is underfunded. It continues to be underfunded. And the cost of expending and educating our students who experience disability has never been met in the standard of IDEA, of the promise of the 40% excess cost. And so anything we do that would reduce that creates further burden and impact on the students we serve. And so not only do we hold this standard because it is an obligation of our federal dollars, we also believe it is the right thing for the students we serve. So we're going to look at the two different standards and then how we calculate those. The first is the eligibility standard. And again, this is how we budget. Next slide, please. The Federal Code of Register says the purpose of establishing this is to, in an eligibility award year, that the budget must be met to maintain this standard. So we'll discuss within the 4 methods how you can meet this obligation. But right now, what you would be thinking about is my budget, is the prepared budget that we are generating and we're putting in front of our budget committees, meeting the obligations of this standard of maintenance of effort? Other things to consider in this is you want to think about your ESD service dollars, your resolution dollars, and where this lives, because those count as part of your expenditure. So whether you are part of an ESD that does transit money and moves it through, or just does it all in resolution, you would work with your local ESD, your local service plan, to review this information with your budget office to see in that chart of accounts where you have a 320 accounting again for maintenance of effort. Without these funds, you may not accurately be determining your eligibility standard. The annual IDEA application has been updated and adjusted. Our fiscal team has done an amazing job of updating the application. So when you enter information, it's not static, it is populated to help you determine what you need to for the minimum amount, what should be there. And so you can go back and then check the information on your budget before it's prepared. LEAs are provided the amount expended in the last fiscal year they met by method. And in that application, they must provide assurance for budgeting at least the amount provided. So here's 2 scenarios we'll talk through in an eligibility standard. So the first one is an LEA expended $1 million and met the LEA MOE in federal fiscal year 2018. In the federal fiscal year 2020, it generated a budget of $900,000. This, at first glance, would not meet the eligibility standard. To meet that standard, the district would have to have in place a plan knowing there was going to be allowable exceptions for that reduction. And we'll talk through what those exceptions are later on. An LEA also, the example B, an LEA expended $900,000 and met the LEA MOE in federal fiscal year 2018. And in 2020, it budgeted $1 million. Because the gross expenditure, the aggregate total was higher, the LEA would meet just at that number without having to look at any other method. Next slide, please. So the second part of maintenance of effort is the compliance standard, and this is where we expend the money. And so your first part is establishing and maintaining and making sure as we go forward this spring with your next year's budget that you have budgeted the right amount. And then the second part is going to be the actual expenditure. So it's not enough to simply have it budgeted and then held over and move into the reserve. It has to be expended. So the compliance standard is also in the Code of Federal Registers. It's except as provided in this, funds provided to the LEA must be used to reduce the level of expenditures for the education of students who experience disability made by the LEA by the district. For the local funds below, so it's essentially what it's saying, you have to maintain that level of cost of expenditure out of your general fund from one year to the other, unless you're using the 4 planned exceptions. Next slide, please. Some examples that we've put in here. The first one, if a district expends $900,000 and met in federal fiscal year 2017, and then the following year it expended $950,000, it was an increase year to year, so it would meet the compliance standard. So it expended greater or equal to the same amount as when it previously met. The second one, the LEA expended $900,000 and met in federal fiscal year 2017. And in the subsequent year, 2018, it expended $50,000 less. This would require either a $50,000 payback to the department and OSEP in general fund dollars if they failed to meet, or a planned exception. Then we'll go through those four again. So again, on the first standard, the district would have met. On the second one, the district would have not met unless they had a planned exception.
All right, and so I'm going to talk with y'all a little bit about how we calculate maintenance of effort. Hit the next slide. So the regulations refer to four sources for maintenance of effort. These sources are really actually four ways to calculate maintenance of effort. There are actually only two sources, local and state funds, that districts can use to meet their requirements. So it's either total amount of local funds, total amount combined with state and local, per capita of local, or per capita of state and local. The amount per child identified for special education under Part B, it's the total number of children comes from the official child count of children with disabilities from your December 1 child count. And this includes children for maintenance of effort purposes aged 5 to 21 and should match the child count that's represented in district's 11% cap waiver from the state school fund. So I just wanted to, real quick, we don't calculate local amounts. We have no way of distinguishing from the actual expenditures reports local amounts from state and combined local amounts. So we can do at the state level, state and local total, and state and local total per capita. But if districts want to try and meet by local methods, they are perfectly allowed to do so. They just have to do extra legwork and provide us some documentation. So subsequent years rule basically says the amount to which you compare for a given fiscal year by whatever method. So it's based on the most recent fiscal year that the district met the compliance standard using the same method. This rule applies to both eligibility and compliance standard. So it may not be the most recent fiscal year for which information is available. It might be the preceding, might be a couple of years prior. But it's not necessarily going to be the most recent one prior. So, for example, we have, we're currently working on 2018-19 maintenance of effort. Some districts we can look directly back to 17-18. Some have not met in a couple of years, so we're looking back towards 16-17 or 15-16. But it entirely depends on when you last met by the method that's being looked at. Next. So some of the conversations that we had throughout 2019 about consortia and IDA maintenance of effort, we never intended to imply that districts couldn't come together as a group and pool their IDA funds for the purposes of providing services to children experiencing disabilities. You're perfectly allowed to do that. By all means, have fun. Next slide. However, consortia cannot meet maintenance of effort as a group. Districts have to meet maintenance of effort on their own. Next slide. Now we recognize the change to the 2019 IDA application removing the ability to identify a fiscal agent had some unforeseen downstream effects. So we added that back this year. We're not asking whether or not your district is a member of a consortia. We are simply asking if your district has a fiscal agent they need to identify. More information about how to do that is within the application and instructions that are actively being posted to the web as I speak. However, I want to stress, and the application has similar language, identifying another agency, ESD, another district, whoever, as a district's fiscal agent does not in any way absolve, share, or limit the district's fiscal responsibilities under IDEA. Next. Any questions up to this point about maintenance of effort?
So if you have a question, you can, I believe you can unmute yourself, or you can post it in the chat box on the right-hand side. So we will go to the next one, and if you have questions, feel free, we can come back and keep addressing this.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the updates to the application. Next slide. So the IDEA application covers two broad functions. One, it's allowing districts to assure to the tenets of IDEA, other federal regulations and laws, and our Oregon state statutes and administrative rules. Two, it's also the application for IDEA funds. So it's how you say, I want these funds that I am entitled to. It needs to be signed by the district superintendent or their next highest authority, and a business official at minimum. If somebody is filling out the application for the district and that person is not either of the two previous signatories, then the preparer needs to sign it as well. Please only send us one application, and please do that electronically to the email address on screen. Next. So this is a pretty marked departure from previous practice. So we've had its own little slide. In the past, almost every agency that received IDEA funds had to sign some modified version of the form, the assurance application. However, after speaking with some federal partners and technical assistance partners and our own procurement professionals, we determined this was actually unnecessary. So starting with the federal fiscal year 2020 application, only districts are going to be asked to complete the assurance application. So all other contractors and grantees, we're just going to include the assurance language in with your agreement, whether it be a contract or a grant. This is going to include such programs as regional programs, EIECSD, LTCT, regional or hospitals, pediatric nursing, JWYSET, as necessary. Next. So some other market changes. It used to be a Word/PDF form. Now it's been replaced by an Excel form, and I'll show you a screen grab of the main screen here in a minute. I'm going to stress that electronic signatures are allowed, and that means you can even take a picture of your signature and attach it to the signing page. So long as you consent to using your electronic signature, there's a spot to do that on the form. If you don't do that, however, we will still need you to print out at least the signing page, sign that, scan it back, and email it to us. So it now shows the estimated allocation for the coming fiscal year for both Section 611 and Section 619, and it's broken out by the program that the funds support. Again, I'll show you that in just a minute. Districts must also positively affirm that they're applying for said funds. So in the past, we did that you can decline the funds, but we've been told that that's not allowable. So what is allowable is saying, I want to apply for those funds. If a district says that they do not want to apply for funds, that's fine. We're not going to immediately reallocate those funds, but we will earmark them for something else later. The application also now shows the amount spent in the fiscal year they last met maintenance of effort to help you with the budgetary standard. It also provides the district's notification of the district's 2018-19 maintenance of efforts status. It provides a place for you to enter in the information about exceptions for that purpose. And it also includes the IDEA fiscal risk assessment. We sent this back. We sent a version of this for the 18-19 fiscal year back in November. We are now including it as part of the application process. Next slide. And so this is the main screen. This is the only screen I'm going to show at the moment because we're going to do a more in-depth webinar at a later date. But this is the main screen. As soon as you select a district, and we're picking on Newburgh because Candace let me, it shows the districts, as you can see, all of the funds for IDEA for each section, and it's broken out by program. If a district selects that they do not want to apply for a specific section, that column on the far left that says LEA/district, that will be adjusted based on the answer to whether or not you're applying for the funds. The regional OSD and LTCT columns are what you assure to under the fiscal section of whether or not your district wants to retain those funds or allow ODE to manage those funds for you. Hospital and ECSE, you don't get a choice about that. That's why it's kind of grayed out. It's there for informational purposes. But
right, James, can I pause for a second? So I think this is really important. We have a lot of questions that come up both from our regional partners and districts around this, the expenditure standard and thinking about the IDEA application. So if you look at your total amount and then the regional contribution, so a district again has to elect and determine if they're going to retain those funds and provide services directly, or if they're going to allow those funds to flow through to the state to be populated into the regional contracts. And then the same thing for Oregon School for the Deaf and long-term care and treatment programs. We've had lots and lots of questions about this particular one, so I want to make sure we pause, and if people have questions about how to fill that out, what that looks like, the new application should be easier for people to determine the amount eligible. But if somebody has a question now in the chat is a good time, or you can also unmute yourself. Okay.
I also wanted to mention that the gross total that you see on the far right, that is the amount that your district's private school proportionate share is going to be calculated off of. And the form actually helps you do that as well if you have private schools that you need to calculate that for. That's all I wanted to show about the application at this time. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. And that's where we're going to open it up for questions again, maybe just for a minute or so. If you don't have any questions, we'll go ahead and move on.
So we'll go to the next section, which is allowable costs, and thinking as you're planning forward, and there's the IDEA, this is the allowable cost you have for IDEA. Remember your general fund that we talked about before, your maintenance of effort, expenditure, and compliance standard, that can be for a lot of provision of service for students who experience disability. And so you have a wide range of flexibility in your 100 funds. And this one, we're thinking about what is generally coded in your 200 accounts. It's your special revenue funds. And so thinking about allowable costs for the provision of the IDEA grant specifically. Next slide, Mary. So under IDEA.
Real quick, before we go further, I just got an email from one of the participants that they're not allowing, the system isn't allowing them to unmute or post questions into chat. So that may be why everybody's silent.
I was thinking it was really, really quiet. Either we're really good at presenting the information or everybody had this down pat. Eric and Mary, can you work on the background at finding out why we have no questions or chat availability, please? And I'll go through allowable costs, and that'll give us time to open up actually for a little longer into the question. So IDEA as a federal grant, it falls under the Federal Uniform Grant Guidance. It must be, for expenditures related to your IDEA, must be necessary, reasonable, allocable, and adequately documented. And we have a couple examples of this where claims for IDEA reimbursement have been on hold or have been, a district has to work through a process of providing documentation for that. And so you want to make sure that with your business office, any expenditure or standard for that is maintained. All documentation submitted for these claims must be able to answer the 4 questions above.
So
Next
questions
slide.
are coming in the question pane now, but not in the chat for some reason, so I can read them to you. It says, what's the
I
date
can grab it here. Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yep.
Regarding the assurance and application, what is the date the form is available for us?
The application, it goes live today, and so it will be open and posted.
And then can you review the 11% cap, please?
Yeah, so I can go over, let's go through that after, let me go through the allowable cost of IDEA and then we can go back to 11%. So IDEA allowable cost, we can go pretty quickly through this. Is the expenditure necessary to provide students who experience disability the education and related service, and is it documented as part of the IEP or other procedural documents? Next slide. And is it reasonable? One of the areas that's calculated under uniform grant guidance is a prudent person. Would they pay this amount, or would it be excess to what somebody with a reasonable standard would set for a cost? And would the cost be the same if there was no federal funds available? Is the cost an excess cost? Is it because of the provision of education for students who experience disability? Would it exist without special education? Example, we always go to thinking about 3rd grade reading curriculum. So if you're purchasing for students who experience disability, you can't use IDEA in isolation to buy 3rd grade general ed curriculum, that it's really for the provision of specially designed instruction and thinking about what does that look like on top of enhancing what the general education does. Next slide. And it must be adequately documented. So jumping ahead, so we are providing a list that's going to be released on the special ed site, special ed finance website, and it will have all the detailed information. It will have some yes, definitely allowable costs, and some definitely no, not allowable. And if you have unique situations or you have questions about that, you can email ode.ideafinance@state.or.us. So with that, I think we can go to, now we have access to all the questions. Thank you, Eric, for helping us figure that out. I can, regarding the assurance and application, the date the form is available, and James, did you give a closure date on that, when it's due?
When it's due, it'll be due, it's typically due June 1st. We're going to push that out another 2 weeks because we didn't post this for 2 weeks after when it was supposed to be posted. So everybody's going to have at least an extra 2 weeks.
So June 15th. will be the date. So Brian asked about the 11% cap. So the 11% cap is when you think about the revenue that comes from your state school fund, that you receive money, you get the first weight of state school fund payment. And then for students who experience disability, you get a double weight up to that 11% cap. Anything beyond that, there's a variable calculation that Mike Wiltfong's office does that changes that rate. But it really, you want to think about you receive double weight up to 11%. And then James had mentioned that that number was generated based off of your December 1 child count. Let's see, Lisa asked, how do budget reductions for early intervention, early childhood special ed and regional impact ODE's maintenance of effort? So it does impact, Lisa, in the same way we brought up the maintenance of financial support. And so one of the areas that we are going to try and continually think about is any expenditure we take that's a reduction of general fund impacts the state's MFS. And so if we don't maintain that standard or it's not brought back in another way, either by the governor's office or the legislative group coming back, then there is the potential of us having a reduction of our state IDEA award in the future years because we will not meet that maintenance of financial support. So we're doing a lot of communicating, trying to share where we're at in this budget process, what that means, in the same way that we're asking each of you to do a lot of communication and sharing that it's not a sweeping budget. It's not a tool that's easily just reduced because there's implications later that cost students. And so it's not just a cost now, but it will be a detrimental cost in subsequent years. And so we're doing a lot of trying to share and understand, help people understand the implications of that, Lisa.
There's a question, if we spend more on SPED from 1819 to 1920, is this our new MOE? And the answer is it depends. So if your district met maintenance of effort in 1819, which the application will tell you, whatever you spend in 1920, as long as it's more than that, yes, that will be your new maintenance of effort. But if you didn't meet in 1819 and you didn't find any allowable exceptions, then no, it won't be. It'll be whatever year prior to that that you actually met maintenance of effort.
Simon asked a question about transportation reduction. There is not an exemption that allows a decrease in cost in any area, including transportation, in any part of a maintenance of effort calculation at this moment.
Lisa also asked what's the due date for the assurance form. I know we already said it, June 15th, but I want to also stress that because of all of the changes, we are going to give as much grace and patience as possible to districts. And so if you need more time, we will gladly give it to you.
The costs for regional programs are pre-populated in the IDEA application. So when you select your district, the information is populated in there. So it's easy for you to determine how much that amount is and to work with your regional program provider on that.
So there was another question from Danielle. When we look at the IDEA estimates, if districts continue with regional OSD, et cetera funding, is column B the amount that will flow through to districts? So if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's if the district elects to retain those funds, yes, those columns, instead of going to those programs, will get rolled up to the district and it will go straight to the district.
Can we address exceptions? Yes, the 4 exceptions. So that's a miss. We said we were going to talk about those, James. So the 4 things. There's 4 areas that we can support you with if you have to change or reduce your expenditure standard for maintenance of effort. The first one is if you have a high cost student that moves out of the area or out of a program or the needs change, If they move from a self-contained to a program that's more inclusive, then those costs shift, and that's an allowable cost. Another one is if you have a high-cost staff member that retires and you replace them with a staff member that does not cost the same amount, that difference, that delta is also in there. James, you want to do the other two? I can grab.
Yeah, so there's also an exception for a reduction in the enrolled students. So if you had a certain number, if you had 20 students with disabilities served in fiscal year 17-18, and you had 15 served in fiscal year 18-19, you will get a reduction based off of that. We typically calculate that for you. There's another one that we don't use, and that's the high cost disability, because we don't fund a high cost fund out of the IDEA funds. And then lastly, there is an adjustment that can be done in certain circumstances that requires additional spending requirements on the district and reporting requirements. But that only happens if your application reduces from one year to the next.
I think in those 4 areas, you want to work with our team, and they will support you and your the special ed director in the business office to look at other expenditures and to look at allowable costs in areas and where those may apply, and how you can work together to make that maintenance of effort obligation standard met. Martha asked, yes, the slideshow, we will post it, and also the information. There are business managers that are on this call, and also tomorrow they're getting this information at OASBO with James and I.
Patty's asking what happened to determine the change in determining regional as a district choice. After a review of our own state laws, it's the language around how regional programs and programs of the sort are supposed to be funded, and it is a district choice.
It came out of, yeah, that one also came out of the OSEP audit last year, so that was a change in last year's application for regional funding. So the adjustments or districts being having the opportunity to elect in and out came out of that, and then a review from CIFR, the Center for IDA Fiscal Reporting, and so that's how that change surfaced. Last year, no districts elected to take regional dollars. All districts elected to keep it in the state contracts.
Yes.
James, Brenda asked, and if we met, I want to know if our maintenance of effort is increased now based on what we needed to spend this year for our increased number of students.
So yes, it should. If I remember off the top of my head, looking at the numbers, yeah, your expenditures went up considerably in fiscal year 18-19. So if you met 18-19, which I believe you did, that's going to be your new floor.
Other grant areas that we are looking at funding, we've mentioned on some other webinars that we're looking at a compensatory education grant to help offset the cost of that, as well as a summer bridge program. The department's still working on releasing that information as we finalize our allotment plans and budget going forward. And the 11% cap, sorry, we're reading these questions as is the 11% cap meaning 11% of the number of students or 11% of the state school fund awarded? 11% of the students, of the population of students. So if your district population of students who are identified under IDEA is 14%, you receive double weight only for the first 11, the full 11 or the full double weight.
There was a question from Lisa about budget reductions for EIE, CSE, and regionals, and if it impacts ODE's MOE. I don't know if that was actually answered or not.
It does impact ODE's MOE. That one we talked about with MFS. Michael asked, speaking about ODE determinations for significantly disproportionate, we did already send notifications to the districts that are flagged for SIGDIS this year, and they will be under CCEIS, which is the mandatory 15% redirect. And so we did, if you were not notified, those special ed directors received calls from me directly, so they know who they are, or an email, and we've already corresponded. If we incur new expenses due to social distancing and what that might mean for transportation, could there be exemptions under maintenance of effort? Those are not currently allowable exemptions for maintenance of effort. There is the ability a district is going to have under the Federal CARES Act and the money that's flowing through. We're looking anywhere from 55 to 60% of your Title I allocation that's going to be in the federal CARES money, the stimulus money coming in, that's intended to support excess costs related to the COVID pandemic. And we support, and Rick's office has released the 9 areas that's allowable. And it is a wide swath of information of things that can be funded through that. So there's much that you can associate related to COVID that's specific to that.
Stacy's asking, if we decide to retain our regional dollars, can you explain what services are included in those regional dollars? So that's, if I'm understanding your question, I don't believe that's how it works. You get the funds and you need to figure out how to provide those services.
So, and if you elect to allow those funds to go through, I would say this is a conversation you want to have with your regional program provider. And so you want to be asking, if this is the amount of dollar generated by my district for this, is this an equal amount of service? Does this make sense for us? It's really important for districts to think about economy of scale in this with regional programs. Regional program providers provide specialists that often districts cannot in isolation hire, and that can have devastating effects if they start to get pulled off. And so I really encourage, even though we're in a budget situation where people are looking to have really, really good conversations with your regional providers to determine what does that look like. Also, in doing that, before you expend any funds or are able to claim any funds, you have to have an approved plan on file. Kara Williams and Linda Brown have a plan application on, and they can give you access to that as well. We have it on our website. And that, so you want to be thinking about, for all the students who might have a really low incidence disability, how are you going to go through all of the standards for that, including child find, service provision, equipment? What does that look like? And that could be in partnership with your ESD or regional provider, but you definitely want to engage in those conversations if that's an area you're considering.
Simon's asking, how do we advocate to allowances for costs that we are avoiding due to the governor's order?
Simon, I'm not sure I understand this question. How do we advocate to? Maybe send me an email or we can set up a phone call to talk through this, because I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're looking for in that. We will add our exceptions to the PowerPoint before it gets posted, so you can see all of that on there. Yeah, the work share. So it will affect your maintenance of effort if you are expending less money. And so because that's not an allowable reduction, so if you're furloughing staff to save money, you need to think about it in the same way as any other furlough or reduction, right? So in that, you have to make a plan thinking about that maintenance of effort bar. And so it is something to consider and to talk through with your superintendent and your business office. The work share being mentioned in here, is the support for relief under the Federal CARES Act, which allows an employer to essentially furlough some time and recoup it with the employee receiving unemployment benefits. There is no provision under IDEA that allows for a district to not have the maintenance of effort obligation with that it would be taken as a standard of reduction, just like if you were doing a reduction in force or if you were doing a standard furlough, even though it's through the federal work share program.
However, if you're paying for any of these teachers or professionals or staff members out of IDEA funds purely, that will not affect your maintenance of effort. It's right. Only general funds, only Fund 100 attributed to Area of Responsibility 320. You're paying for anything out of IDEA funds purely, it's not going to, and you stop paying for that, you might have a problem with supplement, not supplant, but it will not affect your maintenance of effort.
We also, on the application, LEAs will continue to elect for long-term care and treatment dollars, and those flow to the contracts. And again, that's only for districts that have eligible sites in them because they have the obligation of FAPE.
Candace, I think I can unmute Simon if you want me so he can try to ask his question again.
That'd be wonderful.
Simon, can you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes. Hi, Simon.
Hi. So with the governor's order, there are certain costs that we would have incurred had we stayed in session, such as substitutes and transportation. But because we've moved to distance learning, we won't be incurring those costs. So potentially we may not meet MOE because of that. So is there any allowance or adjustment for that? Or do we need to figure out how to go spend that transportation and substitute money?
Yeah, I would encourage it. There's not currently, Simon, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, it's a question that we've raised to OSEP and we have pushed at the federal level as state directors trying to understand this obligation, both because the states are going to have the same issue as local LEAs meeting this. Currently, there is not an exception for this. And so we've looked for districts to find creative ways to, if you previously had it in an area where you were thinking you were going to fund it under like a transportation or your sub cost, what are other costs that you can expend in that standard? Or can you look at expenditures you had that were coded not as a 320, but could be because they were specifically for students who experience disability. And so that's another avenue where we're supporting districts to work with, because again, districts get to, under the local control, elect if an expenditure has a 320 code or not.
I also understand the governor is encouraging districts to participate in the work share program, which would lower our expenditures even further.
Something to consider and to make sure everybody is fully informed of the implications of each decision. Right.
Lisa is asking if we should expect regional funds be consistent from 2019-20 to this year because they're not based on student census. So actually the amounts attributed to regional programs are based on the current student or December child count census. The overall gross amount attributed to the district is based on population and poverty, not student census. Not December child count census, that is, but the amounts attributed to each program is based on December child count census. I don't foresee it fluctuating much, but it does fluctuate a little bit.
Danielle mentioned that they're currently running preliminary calculations, looking to see that with the removal of transportation subs, furloughing, where they're going to land. And I think that's a really smart move right now. I'd also encourage you at the same time to be thinking about where you had expenditures that were not coded with 320 that could pick up that code if you're in that spot, and vice versa. If you're in a district that is sitting, planning ahead, thinking about, if you support with general funds, for example, a behavior specialist that supports multiple students, and you had part of their time allocated to 320, you could think about where those expenditures live for the rest of this month, and how you can expend that differently. And then I would definitely add, if you are running your numbers and you're starting to calculate this and you are coming up either over or under, to reach out to our fiscal team. Mary, can you go to the next slide? And reach out and we can support you with options and ideas to move forward. So anybody on this team, you can email me, you can email Rayanne, James, Michelle, Richard. This is our fiscal team that's been building all this information and supporting all of your questions. And so, along the way, if something comes up or you are perplexed by something, I would encourage you to reach out.
Brenda also has a question about, are we considering increasing the 11% cap for double weight?
That is not a decision that we get to make under our office. That comes from the state school fund carve out. And so that would be a conversation with the Legislative Assembly.
Landon is also asking, does the Comp Ed grant mean we have determined we will need to offer it?
So we are working on a guidance document right now with a number of district providers who to work through extended school year and compensatory education. The department said from the beginning, we believe there are some students that distance learning for all would not meet their the standard of education, and so a district would need to meet and determine the effect of closure. And so the Comp Ed grant, and it's going to be a non-competitive grant to be able to recoup costs related to that, because we want districts to be really thinking about this. Compensatory education has historically been when there's a problem or when something has gone wrong. This is not the result of that, and so we're encouraging districts to think about Comp Ed in a little different way, and not as a problem to an obligation or denial of FAPE, but really as a proactive means to say this student has had a disproportionate impact of closure. All students are going to have some impact with this, right? All general ed students, everybody. But if the student that you're looking at and the team's looking at, you determine that the impact was significantly more because of the disability the student has, then and how it's manifested during this closure time, then that grant is going to be eligible for it. Again, that guidance should be, we're looking for, it's in draft stage right now with partners, and it's going to be released early next week.
Sherry is asking who gets to access the website to see all your full allocations. That's public information. It's on our public website, the estimates and the final allocations for everybody. It has been for a while.
Okay.
Sherry's asking.
I think that those are all of our questions. I don't see any new ones. Again, if you have more questions outside of this, feel free to email us and reach out, and we will be able to support you with some answers that are local to your context. Thank you, everybody.
For the time. Participants who have their hands raised, do you want me to go through and see if they have questions?
Yep, if you can open them up, that'd be, yep, we have some time.
Looking through, Callie Owens has her hand raised, so I have you unmuted, Callie, if you want to ask a question.
No, I'm sorry, that was not on purpose.
Okay. Danielle Hudson, if you have a question, you're unmuted. Okay, well, I think you don't. Dana Christie, your hand just came up, so you're unmuted now, Dana. All right, I'm thinking maybe they don't have questions. They've inadvertently raised their hands.
Or yeah, sometimes the unmute isn't always working. So again, feel free to email us. We look forward to partnering with you working ahead in this time. Thank you, everybody.